Manyatta, where Utopia meets Absurdity, Episode 3. Here we stroll down memory lane to the old Manyatta as history so generously dictates. It was a utopia. Here's the picture. It was like a land where the grass never needed trimming, the fruit fell right into your lap, and the very air smelled like someone was brewing your favorite tea. Oh yes, Manyatta was the epitome of paradise. It was like living in the Bible's Garden of Eden, but with free Wi-Fi and no pesky snake to ruin the mood. Nobody had jobs, nobody needed jobs, because why bother when the food served itself? The houses stood ready for occupation, and the idea of tasks was as foreign as the concept of stress. Life was one long vacation, and technology took care of everything, like little robots buzzing around, offering foot massages and bringing you snacks. You see, back in the day, the residents actually had a say in how they were governed. They'd handpick their leaders through a thorough observation and candid training, where wannabe leaders would try their best to prove themselves worthy. You see, at its peak of performance and admiration by the outside world, the administration had convinced itself they'd built the perfect empire, free of stress, full of productivity, and of course no Mondays. In their overzealous state, management thought it wise to shuffle officials around like pieces on a chessboard, with employees jostling for seniority. The result? Chaos. Undesired switches, baffling replacements, people stuck in positions they neither wanted nor understood. Following the management's brilliantly misguided decision to reshuffle employees in a way that made sense only if you were, say, a sleep-deprived raccoon, things went from bizarre to utterly unhinged. New supervisors swooped in with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, tossing around workloads like confetti and expecting their underlings to miraculously embrace the extra strain. Meanwhile, a different faction was caught up in a more colorful complaint, literally. They whined that some employees had mixed skin tones, an affront to their aesthetic sensibilities and an inconvenience to their eyes, which they claimed couldn't properly register or reflect certain hues. The solution? Only employ people with uniform, eye-friendly skin colors to accommodate their vision's bafflingly specific requirements. Because apparently the future of Manyatta depended on monochromatic employees to soothe the delicate eyes of its most eccentric residents. Eventually, it came to the point where applying for a position in Manyatta required more than just qualifications. It demanded a complete aesthetic transformation. Prospective employees had to either artfully fix their noses or submit a true-to-life photo to prove their appearance met the residents' ridiculous standards. For some, this meant resorting to a touch of Botox to shape their noses into more acceptable forms. And it didn't stop there. Skin tone was scrutinized with the same absurd intensity, pushing many to bleach their skin in desperate attempts to fit in with whatever hue was currently in favor. These employees had reached their breaking point. Every shift began with the same humiliating charade, a parade where they were lined up like contestants in some twisted beauty pageant, except the judges were the residents, who selected their service provider based on skin tone, appearance, and of all things, the shape of their noses. Heaven forbid you were born with the wrong nose shape. That was practically a death sentence in the world of Manyatta. Those with undesirable features were mercilessly tossed around like unwanted party favors. One moment you'd be rejected by a resident who didn't want you near their room, and the next you'd find yourself assigned to someone who decided they were suddenly fasting and didn't need food, or perhaps discovered an immediate and suspicious allergy to showering. It didn't matter how good you were at your job. If your nose offended someone or your skin tone didn't blend well with the decor, you'd be left to wander aimlessly between those who didn't want to look at you and those who outright refused to need you. It was discrimination on steroids, wrapped in a ludicrous, self-righteous bow. The result? A quiet, simmering revolt among junior staff who quickly grew tired of this administrative circus. Voices of discontent started to ripple through the ranks, but every grievance was met with the stone-cold indifference of their newly appointed overlords. So the employees did what any self-respecting, overworked soul would do. They began plotting. If they couldn't beat the system, they'd outsmart it. It all began innocently enough: brief, whispered meetings between disgruntled employees, huddled in tight circles, airing grievances about unbalanced workloads and the downright ridiculous demands of the narcissistic citizens they served. What started as fleeting exchanges of frustration quickly gained momentum, snowballing into longer, more organized venting sessions. Before long, these impromptu gatherings were a daily ritual, popping up multiple times a day, often timed with the precise moment senior administrators left the room. What began as a 5-minute mutterfest soon stretched into full-blown brainstorm marathons, some lasting over an hour. Ideas were born, nurtured, and raised to rebellious adulthood, all without a single written word or recorded minute. Who needed pen and paper when you had sheer discontent as your driving force? Employees became experts in subversive strategizing, their meetings an underground movement disguised as casual conversations. The workplace wasn't a hive of productivity, no, it was a breeding ground for meticulously plotted insubordination. Thus began the era of working smart, where they artfully gave the illusion of productivity while actually doing just enough to keep the administration blissfully ignorant. Meanwhile, the citizens unwittingly bore the consequences of this rebellion, dealing with delayed services and half-hearted efforts, all thanks to the silent, petty resistance of disgruntled workers, trapped in Manyatta's warped corporate dreamland. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, enters the mastermind behind the magic soup. The soup. Oh, the soup. A concoction so quacky, so utterly ridiculous, that it left its victims in a state of pure bewilderment. And mind you, it didn't even matter if you drank from the same straw this thing had range. One sip and you could become a monk or a pirate. Undoubtedly, this mastermind brain orchestrated the coup that flipped Manyatta from an idyllic utopia to a chaotic dystopia. She was the mastermind who brewed the first batch of that infamous memory-erasing soup right in her apartment, the concoction that would later undo everything the realm stood for. Her first few subjects were all senior administrators systematically and with accuracy one by one, starting with Billy, then Martha, Enrique, and all staff of administration block, the entire team who held the Manyatta community's fragile strings together. One spoonful in, and the cracks would begin to show. The once sharp and precise in minds of administrative duties began experiencing bouts of memory erosion during board meetings, fumbling through agendas like a confused puppy chasing its tail. Minutes were misinterpreted, decisions were reversed, and the whole governance structure unraveled into nonsensical chaos. But uncouth mastermind wasn't satisfied with just few victims. No, that would have been far too easy. Like a twisted puppeteer, she expanded her sinister influence, introducing the soup to all the residents. The effects were swift and devastating, a cacophony of miscommunications, with everyone speaking in a cocktail of reversed languages no one could decipher. The entire town was plunged into a haze of confusion, where conversations sounded like scrambled radio signals and logic had no foothold. And behind it all, lurking in the shadows, was mischievous Master Chef, cackling as her concoction turned Manyatta upside down, the residents unknowingly trapped in the chaos she had so artfully designed. Ah, the soup. The culinary disaster that brought Manyatta's so-called utopia to its knees. In an inexplicably kind gesture, this elite contortionist served up his toxic brew to Billy, the senior director, a man who suddenly forgot he'd ever set foot in a classroom. Yes. After one mega celebration probably involving karaoke and a questionable amount of tequila, Bill was lost in the mix. He emerged from that party as a man so profoundly confused, he didn't even recognize his family, his job, or his own reflection in the mirror. The man went from being a corporate shark to needing a babysitter, Enrique, no less, who promptly became his life partner in a soup-induced bromance. All it took was one ladle of this culinary abomination, and suddenly Billy's life was a tragic sitcom. All it took was one ladle of this culinary catastrophe, and Billy's life spiraled into a tragic sitcom with a laugh track only he could hear. At first, everyone shrugged it off, assuming Billy had overindulged in one too many cocktails of questionable origin. Surely, they thought, this fabled memory loss would sort itself out in time. Oh, how wrong they were. Billy didn't just lose track of his keys or forget his anniversary, he lost everyone. He waltzed alone in the parking lot to music that didn't exist, clapping offbeat to his own internal chaos. He held impromptu tributes to imaginary employees, complete with heartfelt speeches. And let's not forget the grand awards ceremony, where Billy, now self-appointed CEO of Neverland Enterprises, handed out honorary plaques to ghostly workers whose names no one could spell or verify. The parking lot had never seen such grandeur, nor such complete absurdity. The impromptu meeting stretched from dusk to dawn, devolving into an all-night spectacle of confusion and unfiltered chaos. Security had the roughest night of all, juggling their sworn duty to protect their boss while simultaneously trying to navigate his newfound delusion. Lost in a blissful haze of imaginary parades and honorary ceremonies, their boss had apparently gone intergalactic mentally, at least. Every respectful attempt to signal that he seemed, well, not entirely present backfired spectacularly. Instead of reeling him in, it only prompted him to extend his list of awards, summoning administrative staff to deliver imaginary pep talks before he presented invisible certificates. Security stood baffled, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or just quit. Any attempt to gently steer him toward the executive lounge for some much-needed rest turned into an escalating fiasco. The closer they got, the more he doubled down on his mission, addressing phantom audiences with all the fervor of a motivational speaker. Eventually, tire and spend, confused and still fogged, his spiral led him to Enrique's apartment, where he found his final hideout. But from that moment on, no amount of coaxing or logic could convince him otherwise. Billy and Enrique were now roommates. One poor Martha was not spared too. The most trusted administrative deputy and part-time nursery school teacher, she was never the same. One day she's reading Goodnight Moon, the next she's a one-woman wrecking ball, wreaking havoc on everyone she touched. Martha's disastrous downfall wasn't some random act of cosmic chaos, oh no. She was reaching a little too far into the tangled web of soup-induced calamities that had already turned Billy, her senior administrator, into a parking lot performer. Desperately trying to piece together the shredded remnants of Billy's memory, she started poking where she didn't belong, connecting dots that weren't hers to connect. It didn't take long for the puppet masters to notice. Martha was sniffing around the soup pot like a detective at an all-you-can-eat buffet, and her curiosity was a little too sharp for comfort. She wasn't just nosy, she was dangerously close to figuring out the secret recipe. Of course, the masterminds weren't about to let that slide. So, on one perfectly ordinary day during a routine workplace huddle, where everyone pretended to care about productivity, Martha's drink was ever so delicately seasoned to perfection. And just like that, the dots she was so eager to connect unraveled into a kaleidoscope of chaos. Her memory didn't just fail, it staged a full-on rebellion. One moment she was Martha, the sharp-as-a-tack deputy; the next, she was arguing with the office printer about why it wouldn't join her for coffee. Martha's logic took a nosedive straight into absurdity. In her soup-soaked brain, the office printer wasn't just a machine, it was a co-worker with feelings, aspirations, and apparently a need for caffeine, if it can work tirelessly printing papers. She reasoned with utter conviction, then surely it gets tired too. And maybe, just maybe, it deserves a coffee break. With that, Martha would graciously extended an invitation to the unsuspecting printer, urging it to join her at the coffee runner cafeteria next door. She would even patted the top of the printer, whispering, "You've earned this," before glaring at anyone who dared to suggest the machine might not, in fact, have the motor skills required to drink a latte. Failure to make one step forward? Oh, that was not an option for Martha. If the poor printer refused to walk, she'd take matters into her own hands, literally. With a Herculean mix of determination and misplaced rage, she'd start dragging the reluctant employee across the floor, leaving a trail of shattered plastic and broken dreams in her wake. Security personnel watched in sheer disbelief, caught somewhere between horror and uncontrollable laughter, as Martha's fury mounted at the printer's insubordination. Desperate to stop her from reducing the already struggling machine to a pile of junkyard scraps, they scrambled to think on their feet. The only viable solution? Convince Martha that the printer, yes, the non-responsive employee, was being terminated on the spot, with immediate effect. While another solemnly assured her, "We'll escort it out of the building," it was the only way to stop the carnage. The masterminds watched from the shadows, knowing they'd turned another threat into a punchline. The soup worked its twisted magic on Enrique, too, turning his once pristine social worker skills into a nightmarish version of human ineptitude. The evil mastermind behind the notorious memory-fixing soup, or memory erasing, depending on your luck, didn't stop at her culinary terrorism. Oh no, she had to assemble her own band of misfit collaborators, handpicked from the lower ranks of Manyatta's workforce. These were the folks who had been bumped down the pecking order for lack of seniority, but were still bizarrely trusted by leadership. How? Who knows? Maybe it was the soup. These four under-the-radar puppeteers managed to control the entire empire with four strategically brilliant departments: food, community, census, social welfare, and security. Talk about a monopoly on dysfunction. They ruled without lifting a finger, governed with zero effort, and controlled the masses like it was the easiest thing in the world. No protests, no riots, just blissful obedience. It's as if they sprinkled some extra chill-out seasoning into the soup. Every fortnight, these secret overlords would gather for their nightly meetings, conveniently scheduled the day after the brain-melting soup was served. Because nothing says effective governance like a room full of people with half-erased memories plotting their next move. With Bill, the senior manager, lost in a perpetual haze of who am I, and Enrique spiraling into his own self-inflicted self-destruction grenade, Martha became the accidental steward of chaotic demolition derby. She strutted around like she owned the place, which, let's be honest, she practically did, thanks to a little soup-induced rebranding. As for the other manager, well, he pieced out after one fateful sip of the soup. Retirement never looked so abrupt. This left the quad gang free to pull the strings with the precision of puppeteers on caffeine. Their secret weapon? A perfect balance of brainwashed workaholism and iron-fisted delegation. Department heads were turned into soulless automatons, just the right amount of performance mixed with a heavy dose of don't ask questions. Just do as I say. It was a management style so effective, even the soup couldn't erode it. The four masterminds, let's call them the soup-laced quartet, realized that with a little nudge from the tech giants and a secret backroom handshake with Big Pharma, they could control Manyatta like a puppet on strings. Forget democracy or whatever that nonsense used to be called. Why? Because who needs traditional leadership when you have microchips, magnetic garments, and overpriced pills? Here's where it gets genius. Under the guise of showcasing new products, the tech wizards from Silicon Valley and their pharma buddies rolled into Manyatta with all the bells and whistles of their shiny gadgets. But wait, these weren't just any gadgets. No, no, no. While the outsiders oohed and ahed over public exhibitions for the newly developed next-gen smartphones, electronics, laptops, and other virtual reality headsets, the real magic was happening behind the curtain. The techs slyly slipped in their most effective human manipulation devices, think mind control, emotion tweaking, memory erasing kind of toys, directly into the hands of Manyatta's ever-oblivious authorities. Armed with their shiny titles and an unshakable belief in their own brilliance, they strutted around Manyatta like they owned not only the land but also the air, water, and every last brain cell of its residents. After all, who needs democracy when you can just decide you're in charge? And to top it off, they had the perfect tools thanks to their tech buddies to keep everyone in line, whether through mind-melting gadgets or the "you don't know it yet but you agree with me" soup. The new self-elected, self-ordained authorities, because really, why bother with elections when you can just crown yourself for running the show with a level of delusion that would make a reality TV star blush? These were the kind of people who woke up one morning, looked in the mirror, and thought, yeah, I should probably rule an empire. And let's not forget their infallible logic. Why should anyone else have a say when they've already got it all figured out? Decisions were made behind closed doors, between sips of memory-erasing cocktails, with only one rule: agree with them, or forget what you were even disagreeing about. The soup concoction formula, oh, the crown jewel of Manyatta's mental merry-go-round, was so covertly patented and registered under layers of cryptic codes that even its own ingredients had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Only a handful of licensed manufacturers were permitted to develop bits and pieces of the potion, assembling individual components like clueless pawns. They were merely cogs in the grand scheme, producing fragments of a mind-bending masterpiece without ever catching a whiff of its final, twisted glory. Once the mystery ingredients arrived in Manyatta, it was up to the local authorities, those puppet masters of memory and muddle, to perform the final alchemy. The real magic happened behind closed doors in their labyrinthine kitchens, where they stirred the chaos soup to perfection. Not a single soul outside Manyatta was allowed to lay eyes on the completed formula. The rest of the world was left scratching their heads, while the residents sipped their way into oblivion. Guests and visitors to Manyatta were greeted with an obligatory contract that read more like a death wish disguised as legal jargon. In bold, italicized letters, it spelled out the cardinal rule: eat or drink anything prepared within Manyatta's borders at your own risk. Failure to comply, abandon all hopes, ye who snack here. But of course, human curiosity being what it is, every now and then some poor soul would nibble on a suspiciously free biscuit or sip a deceptively innocent glass of water. And just like that, they'd be sucked into Manyatta's Bermuda Triangle of culinary hypnosis. Those unfortunates few who dared to indulge would inevitably find themselves mysteriously back in Manyatta weeks later, looking bewildered and a little dazed, unable to explain how they ended up there. It was like the town had them on speed dial, summoning them back with an invisible thread of mind-twisting stew and memory-warping tea. Monthly meetings in Manyatta were a circus of absurdity, where residents gathered to air out grievances, pitch ideas, and make demands that bordered on the fantastical. Among the more peculiar suggestions was one that would have made Kafka proud: employees were to be stripped of the right to voice opinions or offer any creative input. Their job, as some residents passionately argued, was not to think or suggest but to work, and work hard. No ideas, no innovations, just mindless robotic labor. End of part 3. The story is written by Nelson Deriva.